Okay, guys, so this week we're going to talk about what exactly intercultural competence is. So last week we talked about adapting to cultural difference, and we looked at, in particular, Bennett's model of developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. So we're going a bit of a step further this week from sensitivity towards competence. Okay, so let's kick things off by looking at the terms first. So two of the really dominant terms that you will see everywhere, really, not just in the academic context, but also in newspapers and in movies even. You'll see intercultural communication and intercultural competence. So what exactly do we mean by the terms and by the various elements of the terms? So when we're talking about inter, we're talking always about in between two things. Okay, so intra meaning within the same thing, but inter between two various things. On the cultural side, we're talking about, not just the language. We're not just talking about cognition, so the way of thinking and perceiving the world. We're talking about behaviors. We're talking about norms. We're talking about values. Are all of the default settings that are hardwired into us, as a result of our language and our way of thinking and the things that we have learned in terms of behaviors and norms and growing up with our families. And then on communication, obviously, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about between two people, and here physically we're talking about between two people and their bodies. And the reason we're talking about their bodies as well is because we're talking about body language. So body language is quite an important part of communication, and certainly body language is also very culturally specific. And again, we're talking about more than just language and cognition. We're talking about the exchange of information and messaging between two people with different backgrounds. And then competence. And what exactly do we mean by competence? Well, in the research literature, what we see is that there's a conceptual difference between what's called the Leib, which comes from the Middle High German Lip, meaning your life, your body, your souls, the essence of your being, right? As opposed to just your Körper, so talking about body language, okay? So competence goes that little bit deeper. It goes into every aspect of your life, your body, and your soul, and your entire being is what you bring to bear in a competent situation. So intercultural communication then really is when two people from different linguistic and cultural backgrounds come together, and we're talking about holistic communication. So, the attempts on both sides to a certain extent to accommodate one another to make sure that communication is successful. When we're talking about competence, though, we're talking about the internalized ability to deal with intercultural difference in an adequate, productive, and respectful manner. So competence runs a hell of a lot deeper than just the communication skills. Yeah, it is this internalized ability, competence, that you have to deal with people with different backgrounds in a productive way, so that the task is achieved, whatever the task is, in a respectful way, so that there's no offense or difficulty caused in the interaction, and also in an adequate way to make sure that the goal of the interaction is accomplished. Okay. So, in further then with the terms we spoke there about intercultural competence, intercultural communication, you'll also see terms like interculturalism, transculturalism, and multiculturalism. So, what are the differences between these various concepts? So, when we're talking about interculturalism, we're talking about the meaningful interaction between members of different cultures who, in the process, transform their cultural stances and create something new in between the traditional cultural patterns of construal. So this is probably the closest thing that we mean in terms of intercultural competence, right? So that when people from different cultures are in interaction with one another, the cultural stances that they normally have from their domestic cultures change in some way. They're transformed as a result of the interaction, yeah? So that both people in this particular interaction, they create something new that is in between the cultural patterns of the various cultures that come to bear. So you kind of, position yourself somewhere between the two cultures in an interculturalism situation. Transculturalism then is the creation of meaning beyond cultural patterns. Okay, and here we're talking about individuals who are culturally footloose, owing loyalty to no single culture, floating freely between them, picking up beliefs, practices, and lifestyles that engage their sympathies, and creating an eclectic way of life of their very own. Okay, so transcultural people, I suppose, are in a way are the minority. Okay, so we could say that some people in a particular country with a different heritage to the dominant culture and language could be seen to be transcultural, but they're only transcultural really if they're very, as it says here, footloose, if they're not bound necessarily to any of those cultures and they float around between them, and they pick and choose on a kind of a pick and mix basis what sort of practice and beliefs and lifestyles that they can identify with, and they integrate that into their identity. So, people with a different heritage to the dominant culture might be necessarily transcultural, or certainly people who have maybe had quite a migrant lifestyle, that they have spent many years in many different languages and cultures as a result of their upbringing. Thinking here, for example, about the children of diplomats, or children who have a parent that's in the military. A lot of travel, a lot of engagement with different languages and cultures, and they integrate various aspects of those languages and cultures into who they are. And then multiculturalism, which is the one you see probably most often. So multiculturalism is really emphasizing the diversity of cultures. And this is very much one of the dominant ideologies within the European Union, multiculturalism and multilingualism. So emphasizing the diversity of cultures that exists, but leaving them untouched, since it's the members of the different cultures do not meaningfully interact, and hence do not create new in between those cultures. Okay, so in a multicultural society, the cultures exist alongside one another without intermingling the patterns of the construal of meaning that exists. Yeah, so if we think of a multicultural society, we have, let's look at the Irish context or even the German context, where you have Irish culture which exists alongside Brazilian culture, Polish culture, Lithuanian culture, Latvian culture, Russian culture, Chinese culture. So the cultures remain as a kind of a clearly fenced off phenomenon, that they exist alongside one another, and they necessarily don't intermingle, so that people from the various cultures don't interact in such a way that they create new meanings and new patterns of cultural meaning as a result of interacting with one another. Okay, so when we're talking about intercultural competence, then what exactly are we talking about? What are the various requirements that people need when they are supposedly interculturally competent? Well, they display respect for others. Okay, so there's a very strong sense there of respecting differences of opinion, different perspectives, different ways of viewing the world, different ways of engaging with particular problems or questions. Yeah, so displaying respect for others. They view interaction in a very positive light, yeah? So the ability to be non-judgmental, and this is a very difficult one because all human beings, it's part of our nature to be somewhat judgmental. So it's very difficult sometimes to move away from that, yeah? And certainly within an intercultural context, it's very difficult sometimes to not judge another culture by the standards of your own culture, okay? So in terms of being interculturally competent, these people tend to be very positive about interaction with other cultures and open to different points of view. They have a very positive orientation towards knowledge, and they accept the non-universality of cultural values. Yeah, so they accept that the ideas of right and wrong are not absolute, that they vary depending on the culture that you're interacting with. Okay, so that kind of knowledge of the non-universality of cultural values. They're empathetic, yeah, so they have a genuine ability to see other people's point of view, okay, and respect that other point of view. And they also have role behavior, and they have a very strong command of role behavior. So they're aware of the expectations and of the constraints that exist in interacting with someone from any particular culture or group of cultures. Okay, so they understand that your role in this sort of interactional situation changes depending on the cultures that you're involved in interacting with. And they're also very strong in interaction management, yeah. So they're very strongly focused on communicative effectiveness and appropriacy. Yeah, so they have the ability to accommodate the other, and that can happen on a linguistic level, in order to make sure that the communication runs as effective as possible. So changing the way you express yourself in order to maximize the chances that the person on the other side can understand you, but also managing the interaction in an appropriate way. And that one is quite a difficult one a lot of times, because if you think about different cultures and how they interact with one another, it can relate to role taking. So when people are interacting with one another, how much time and in what ways is it acceptable to interrupt the other person, and in what ways is it acceptable to be quiet or to give back channeling, nodding and saying yes, etc. It can also be as simple as the level of your voice. So in certain cultures, it's quite common to speak and to express yourself at a higher decibel level than it might be in your own culture. So understanding that and managing that sort of situation. And also, very importantly, they have a tolerance for ambiguity. Yeah, so they have an ability, and a very good ability, to deal with uncertainty. Yeah, so rather than dismissing things that they don't necessarily know about, they have a very open approach to it, and they have an ability to deal with this kind of uncertainty, and rather than it demoralizing them and reducing their capacity for communication, they have a very good ability to deal with uncertainty. Okay, so just very quickly before we move on to the last section of the lecture, what I wanted to do now was to look at the different models of intercultural competence, okay? And these models are always described as process or developmental models, because the more that we've researched the area of intercultural communication, the more we've come to understand that intercultural communication is a process and there is a development involved within it, okay? So these three models are the ones that are acknowledged as being the most suitable to the development of intercultural competence. So the first is Bennett's model of intercultural sensitivity, the DMIS model, which we looked at in the last lecture. So starting with the ethnocentric monocultural side of the spectrum at the bottom left-hand corner, we move from denial into polarization or the defense stage, and then from there we kind of take the middle ground of minimization before we move on to the more multicultural and intercultural ethno-relative side of the spectrum, where we talk about acceptance and adaptation. Okay, so this model is very useful, and as we did in the last lecture, we applied it to your own context, to the various stages that you will undoubtedly find yourself in on the year abroad situation when you're dealing with cultural difference. Okay, so you are undoubtedly at times going to be involved in denial, being uncomfortable with difference and not really wanting to engage with it. You might find yourself in a situation where you feel like you have to defend your own worldview, and create a kind of an antagonistic situation of us versus them. But then eventually you will move beyond that, and what you'll start to do is minimize differences between cultures and start focusing more on the similarities. So starting to realize that, at the end of the day, we're all human, and at the end of the day, we all believe in being a good person, and trying to understand commonalities across cultures rather than differences. Beyond that phase, then we move towards acceptance, which is quite an advanced stage of intercultural development, where you start to recognize that values and difference can be different. And you can accept them for being different without judging them. And then, of course, the top end of developing intercultural competence then is the adaptation side of things, where you're capable of taking the other person's point of view on board and communicating and behaving in a very appropriate and respectful way when you find yourself in a intercultural interaction. Okay, so that model we already looked at in quite a bit of detail in the last lecture. So that's kind of one of the models that's used quite broadly when dealing with the development of intercultural sensitivity, and also increasingly with the development of intercultural competence. So for this first part of the lecture, we'll just leave it there. And in the next section, we'll move on and we'll look at two of the other models that are quite interesting before we move on to the final section.